So given that these are the consequences of budget cutting and tax cuts that have reduced revenue, what broader ramifications do you see developing politically around these teacher protests? Is it going beyond questions of school funding to raise issues about the wisdom of massive tax cutting and budget cutting?
Yes, I think it is going beyond. And what we're seeing in Arizona is that the teachers have asked not only for a raise for themselves and for support staff, and not only for new funding for education for children, but they have said no new tax cuts. So that's a very big demand, especially in a state like Arizona, where politicians have kind of raced to be the ones offering tax relief. So we'll see how that changes, maybe even potentially some midterm races. I mean, my colleague Alexander Burns and I here at the New York Times have written about how some Republicans are starting to move to the center on taxes and say we need to have space in the Republican Party for, sensible policies that would allow us to fund our schools and keep pace with inflation at the very least when funding our schools. Certainly, I'd say that's still a minority of Republicans in these states. The majority of Republicans in these states remain, I think, very committed to the idea that you just want to reduce government size at all costs and continue to cut taxes.
You quote Gary Jones, a former chairman of the Republican Party in Oklahoma and a candidate for governor in Oklahoma, Republican candidate for governor, who is himself questioning the wisdom of all this tax cutting that has taken place.
Exactly. And he's an example of the type of Republican who's maybe introducing a new way to talk about it. And I mean, this is not historically new. It's just new maybe since the Tea Party revolt of the year 2010 or so.
Now, another issue that you mentioned that I find interesting is the connection with the charter school movement and privatization of schools. You write that this has actually hurt school enrollment and therefore indirectly hurt school funding.
Right. So in Arizona, which has really been a wild west for charter schools and for vouchers that allow parents to use tax money to send their kids to private schools, some districts and schools have seen a loss of students to these other options. Now, when you have fewer students, you have less money in your school, and that may be okay in some regards because you have less money to spend on kids that you don't have. But there are some costs that remain the same, even if your student population goes down, say the cost of maintaining the building. So this is something that teachers are anxious about. And I've talked to, traditional public school teachers in Arizona who say these charter schools and private schools are marketing themselves so heavily to parents. We're doing a great job here at our public school, but parents have gotten the message that public schools are failing, and so they're not enrolling their kids.
So, Dana, what's the history here of teacher activism? I mean, teachers, as you pointed out, teachers have always been I think it's fair to say, very idealistic about their profession, their reasons for choosing their profession. But you've also written that the teachers have quite a history of activism when they feel that their interests are threatened.
That's right. I mean, the teacher union movement launched in 1897 in Chicago, and a big issue that motivated female teachers at that time to organize as a union was low corporate tax rates. The schools were just being starved while big companies at the time were paying very low taxes, especially property taxes at that time. So this is a thread that runs through American history. It is not new, and it's very interesting for me, having traced the history back to the late 19th century, to see this happening in 2018. I'll tell you, it is not the story that I expected to be covering this year.
And a lot of these teachers are women, of course, and I think you're right that the teacher union movement was largely founded by women.
Yes, it was founded solely by women, and it was an explicitly feminist suffragist movement in the late 19th century. I think in the mid-20th century, the most famous union leader was Albert Shanker in New York City, and so that gave the teacher union movement a male face for a time in the 60s, 70s, 80s. But now, again, I mean, I think because there's so much other feminist activism going on right now with the Me Too movement, people are talking about how, this is a female profession. We do see that 75% of American teachers remain women to this day.
Back when the teacher movement got started, teachers were very, because it was largely a female profession, almost entirely, the teachers were very poorly paid back at the beginning.
Right, that's right. Of course, over the long course of history, teacher pay has improved exponentially. I mean, teachers used to be paid akin to, say, like a housemaid in the 19th century. Because of collective bargaining and the big strides that were made in the 60s and 70s, with many teacher strikes during that period, the expectation came that, look, teaching was a middle class or an upper middle class profession. It requires a college degree, often a master's degree, and it should be paid accordingly. That said, if you look at teachers compared to other similarly educated workers, teachers are still far underpaid.
So what do you see as being the political implications of this, given that we are having midterm elections coming up? I'm sure that most of the debate must be around governor races or state legislature races. Do you see it spreading beyond to congressional races, for example?
Yeah, so my colleague Alexander Burns and I have looked at this. We think there's only about a half dozen congressional races that could be impacted by this, but we do really think that we will see this teacher movement impacting state legislatures and governor races. I mean, really, this is a very big challenge for the Republican Party, given how sympathetic parents are to teachers and to the idea that their own children's schools should have more money to spend. I was out in Arizona with parents that were protesting alongside their children's teachers, and I did not know what to expect. I started going down the line of parents, typically mothers, asking them, how they were planning to vote, who they typically voted for. And 3-4 women I talked to in a row in suburban Phoenix told me that they were Republicans that were considering voting Democratic this year. So this could have a big impact.